Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through Saudi Arabia and Canada policies and analysis. So my goal is just to give you an overview of the two countries, look at overall policies and look at how they do trade together, and just kind of give you a statement of the importance of foreign relations with different countries. Now, this presentation is only one perspective on Saudi Arabia and Canada policies, including trade and foreign policies. It's not deemed to be the only perspective. I encourage many of you to go out to Google, to Internet Explorer, any sort of sites to kind of review what different people perceive in terms of the relationship, whether it's foreign policy, trade, exports, you name it. It's just to kind of give you a good view of what's going on between the two countries. Here's a little bit about myself. I'm a CPA, CGA by trade, and I spend a lot of time in academia, industry, as well as in software. Now, I'll look at GDP for both countries. I'll talk about comparison of different key areas of policies. I'll talk about foreign relations between the countries. I'll give an overview of export-import analysis, and then I'll summarize what's going forward. Now, Saudi Arabia, like most Middle Eastern countries, drives most of their revenue from oil. So any drop in oil prices impacts the treasury there in terms of its income. And we're seeing that right now with Saudi Arabia's overall treasury. They're running deficits, huge deficits. And that's something to watch out in terms of how Saudi Arabia responds to the oil production cycle in terms of supporting OPEC initiatives or how they move forward with it. They also, too, because it's a desert climate, they also rely on a certain amount of imports to come in to support their economy. And that's something else to bear in mind as they look at diversification in their economy and how they look at more trade deals with different countries. And their key big trading partners are the US, China, and Japan. Now, if we look at Canada's economy in general, it's pretty well diversified. 2% of its GDP is typically oil, but it's got everything else into it, from construction to manufacturing to utilities, so it's basically pretty well diversified. But it drives bulk of its exports to the US, so 70% of its exports are going to the US, with the other big trading partners being Central European Community as well as China. Now let's look at rankings, and this is critical to understand policy, right? So if you look at trade freedom, and you look at monetary freedom, property rights, innovation, technology, red tape, investor protection, corruption, personal freedom, tax burden, market performance. When you compare the two countries, most cases Canada is in a better position in terms of the overall ranking, with a few exceptions. If you look at tax burden, the Saudi Arabias are much better. That if you look at market performance, Canada's a lot better than that. But look at where the key points and key drivers here, which drives things that people get upset about, and that's getting into freedoms. And you'll see in most cases as Canada significantly allows a lot more freedom. It's a lot easier to work with Canada in terms of the government. And that's something to bear in mind when you're hearing discussion in terms of the overall flow. Like everybody else assumes when you go into a country it's very easy to do business with. Well, with this chart here, it shows you there's a lot of work that goes into in terms of doing business in a particular country. So if we talk about relations, okay, and you look at key buckets of it, the biggest thing you're talking about is armored vehicles. Well, the biggest thing uproar was that is because of Saudi Arabia's view on human rights. Now, in essence, you can't change human rights by stopping trade. So what you have to look at is working with these countries to see where there's a better position to help them do reforms there. And that's where the UN has to grab the bull by its horn and be more stronger about pushing countries for reforms in terms of human rights. What people do not know and understand is there's a lot of doctor training and academics. So a lot of people from Saudi Arabia come here to be educated, and that's something that's not well understood. So that's where you're seeing the big relationship there. Oil. Saudi Arabia is a big driver of oil. They've actually, like Canada, it's a big an area of concern with the countries when we see dropping oil policy. Now, I put Iran foreign policy up here. There's always a little bit of dissension between the Middle East because of the way those countries have evolved over time. Now, there's been a change in stance on the Iran policy. The new government in Canada has taken a different stance on Iran. So it'll be interesting to see how Saudi Arabia, the relationships between Canada and Saudi Arabia go forward when you've got some concerns around Iran. Now this looks at merchandise in terms of product. What I really want you to do is look at the bottom row graph, and this is where I want you to look at exports, where you look at motor vehicle parts, machinery and equipment, iron ore, paper, electronics, and all that. That's where Canada exports most to Saudi Arabia. Now the key point here is that we have a trade deficit basically between Saudi Arabia and Canada. That's driven by we import a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia that offsets any of our exports to them. So if you want to reduce your balance of payment, you have to reduce your trade deficit. So that means growing exports. So if we killed a deal like the armored truck deal for Canada's particular case, what would happen is it would impact the trade surplus and deficit. So we have to look at ways to basically expand exports into those growing markets, because they're critical as part of diversification on export, and that's not something to discuss. The other thing in the top right hand corner, you see provinces like Ontario and Quebec, 77% of the exports going to Saudi Arabia are coming from 2 provinces, and those are where the heartbeat of manufacturing. But you also see stuff from Alberta there as well. So it's to bear in mind to understand that components of Canada are benefiting from trade. So here's the critical path as you move forward when you hear discussions of that. Foreign policy is critical driver things. Right now, the new government is trying to look at opening up more relationship with countries. And that's basically what Justin Trudeau is doing. One of his key players is actually a former expat from Saudi Arabia. So to bear in mind that there's strong relationships to look at expanding them into the Middle East. Now that's something to bear in mind as you walk through foreign policy and the development in Canada, as well as understanding things. The other thing to bear in mind too with Saudi Arabia, they're on the Security Council, but they're also heading up the human rights issue. So this is stuff that you need to go out and do some research about the countries. This is not to slam any country in a particular way in their policies, because every country develops differently. What it's about is moving forward with the right agenda, with balance of policies that benefit Canadians as well as Saudi Arabia to do reforms. Really, that's what it's about. We're not going to sit here and debate, or I'm going to debate you who's better, what country's better. What I'm going to say to you is, as we move forward, we have to find ways to work together for the common goal, and that's to better the lives of people in both countries. And that's what the key driver here as you move forward in terms of discussion. If you want to ask your politicians or business, this is what they want. They want to be able to compete on an equal footing. They also want to be able to have access to new markets. Thank you.